A woman stood up from the audience. She said one sentence, and Johnny Carson cried on live television for the first time in his 30-year career. It was March 1982. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank. Another Thursday night. Another monologue. Another 300 people in the audience expecting laughs, celebrity interviews, and Johnny's trademark wit that had made him the king of late-night television for 20 years. The show was running smoothly. Johnny was in the middle of his opening monologue, delivering jokes about the economy, about politicians, about everyday absurdities that made America laugh before they went to sleep. The audience was responding perfectly, laughter in all the right places, applause on cue, the familiar rhythm of a well-oiled television machine. Ed McMahon sat at his desk to Johnny's right, delivering his trademark laugh, occasionally interjecting with, "You're absolutely right," or, "That's wild." The band was ready with bumper music. The cameras were capturing every angle. It was television perfection. Johnny was about to deliver his next joke, something about gas prices, when a woman in the fourth row stood up. Not the excited standing of someone trying to get on camera. Not the playful interruption of a planted audience member. This was something else. Something quiet but impossible to ignore. She was in her late 60s, maybe early 70s. Gray hair cut short and practical. Glasses. A simple cardigan over a blouse. She looked like someone's grandmother, someone who baked cookies and knitted blankets and lived a quiet life. But when she stood, the entire studio felt it. Something in her posture, ramrod straight despite her age, shoulders back, chin up. The bearing of someone who had served. Who had seen things. Who had carried weight for a very long time. Johnny stopped mid-sentence. His smile faded. He looked at the woman with genuine curiosity, not irritation. In 20 years of hosting, he'd learned to read an audience. And this woman wasn't standing to interrupt. She was standing to be seen. "Yes, ma'am?" Johnny said, his monologue voice dropping away, replaced by something more genuine. "Did you want to say something?" The woman's hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady. Clear. The kind of voice that had given orders in chaos, that had comforted the dying, that had refused to break even when everything else was breaking. "Mr. Carson," she said loud enough for the microphones to catch. "I was a nurse in Vietnam. Da Nang. 1968 to 1970. And I just wanted you to know that we watched your show every single night we could. In the nurse's station. On a tiny black and white TV that barely worked. And for 30 minutes we got to forget where we were." The studio went completely silent. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. Johnny's hand tightened on his cue cards. His jaw clenched briefly. That telltale sign that emotion was rising and he was fighting to control it. Ed McMahon leaned forward, his jovial expression replaced by something more serious. The woman continued, her voice starting to shake now but pushing through. "I held boys, because that's what they were, boys, while they died. 18, 19 years old. Scared. Calling for their mothers. And there was nothing I could do except hold their hands and tell them they weren't alone." You could hear the audience's collective breath catch. Some people were already crying. The cameras stayed locked on the woman, on Johnny, capturing this moment that was careening off script into something real. "And you know what some of them said?" The woman's voice cracked. "In those last minutes? They said I wish I could watch Johnny Carson one more time. Because your show meant normal. It meant home. It meant there was still a world where people laughed about gas prices and politicians instead of dying in the mud." Johnny stood up. Not the performative standing he did for comedy bits. This was instinctive, involuntary. He stepped out from behind his desk, his cue cards forgotten, his monologue abandoned. The band didn't play. The audience didn't make a sound. Even the camera operators seemed to move more carefully, more reverently, understanding they were witnessing something that transcended television. Johnny walked to the edge of the stage, as close to the audience as the setup would allow. He looked directly at the woman, who was now crying openly, tears streaming down her weathered face. "What's your name?" Johnny asked, his voice thick. "Margaret. Margaret Sullivan. Margaret," Johnny repeated, and had to pause, visibly composing himself. "How many boys did you lose?" Margaret's face crumpled. "I stopped counting at 200. The number hung in the air. 200 young men. 200 last moments. 200 times holding someone while their life slipped away, offering whatever comfort was possible in impossible circumstances. Johnny's eyes were glistening now. The cameras caught it. Johnny Carson, who had interviewed thousands of guests, who had maintained perfect composure through every moment of his career, was on the verge of tears on live television. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what those years meant. What Vietnam meant. What it cost. By 1982, America was trying desperately to move past Vietnam. The war had ended in 1975, but the wounds were still raw, still festering. The soldiers who came home were often met with hostility instead of gratitude. The nurses, the women who had volunteered to serve, who had waded through blood and horror to save lives, came home to a country that didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to remember, didn't want to acknowledge what they'd sacrificed. Margaret Sullivan had returned from Vietnam in 1970. She'd come home to her small town in Ohio, to a country that was tearing itself apart over the war. She tried to talk about it once. At a church social, someone had asked about her service. She'd started to explain, started to describe the hospital tents, the overwhelming number of wounded, the impossible decisions. The person had cut her off. "Well, we shouldn't have been there in the first place," they'd said dismissively, and walked away. Margaret never talked about it again. Not to her family. Not to her friends. Not to anyone. She'd locked those 2 years away, buried them deep, and tried to build a normal life on top of that foundation of trauma. She'd gotten married. Raised 2 children. Worked as a nurse at a local hospital for 30 years. Became someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's neighbor. Never mentioned Vietnam. Never mentioned the boys she'd held. Never mentioned the nightmares that still woke her up at 3 a.m., gasping, hands reaching for patients who'd been dead for 12 years. But she'd watched The Tonight Show. Every night it was on, she watched. Because Johnny Carson had been there, in those nurses' stations in Da Nang, flickering on that barely working television. His voice had been the soundtrack to brief moments of normalcy in hell. Tonight, she'd gotten tickets to see the show live. A birthday gift from her daughter. She'd sat in that audience, watching Johnny deliver his monologue, and something inside her had broken. The weight of 12 years of silence had become unbearable. So she'd stood up. And she'd spoken the truths she'd been carrying alone for more than a decade. Now, standing in that audience, having just told Johnny Carson and 300 strangers and millions of viewers at home about the boys who died wanting to watch his show one more time, Margaret Sullivan felt simultaneously more vulnerable and more free than she'd felt in 12 years. Johnny was still standing at the edge of the stage, looking at her. His hands were gripping the stage edge, knuckles white. His face was working through emotions. Grief, gratitude, guilt, all fighting for dominance. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying through the entire studio. "I don't know what to say. I can't, there are no words." "You don't have to say anything," Margaret said, wiping her eyes. "I just wanted you to know what you meant. What your show meant. You gave us 30 minutes of home when we needed it most." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny turned to the director's booth. "Cut the cameras," he said. "Johnny, we're live to tape, we can't just—" The director's voice came through the speakers. "I said cut the cameras. Give me 5 minutes. Don't erase the tape. Just give me 5 minutes off camera." The red lights on the cameras blinked off. The studio audience stirred uncertainly. This wasn't how television worked. But Johnny wasn't asking. He was telling. He climbed down from the stage. Actually climbed down into the audience area, something he'd never done in 20 years of hosting. He walked up the aisle to where Margaret Sullivan stood, other audience members parting to make way. When he reached her, he took both her hands in his. The microphones were off, but people in the nearby rows would later describe what they saw. Johnny Carson, the king of late-night television, holding the hands of a Vietnam nurse and speaking to her quietly, just the two of them, while 300 people witnessed in reverent silence. They spoke for 3 minutes. No one knows exactly what was said. Johnny never revealed it, Margaret never shared it. But when they finished, Johnny embraced her. Not a performative hug for cameras. A real embrace. The kind that says, "I see you, I hear you, thank you." When Johnny finally released her and walked back to the stage, his eyes were red. He climbed back onto the platform, sat at his desk, and gestured to the director. "Okay. Cameras back on." The red lights flickered back to life. Johnny looked directly into camera one. He didn't smile. He didn't crack a joke. He just spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, we just had a moment here that I think is more important than anything I was going to say tonight." Margaret Sullivan, a Vietnam nurse, reminded us of something we've been trying to forget. That there were people who served, who sacrificed, who did unimaginable things because they believed in helping others. And when they came home, we didn't thank them. We didn't listen to their stories. We just wanted to move on. He paused, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and wiping his eyes without shame. "Well, I'm listening now. And I want to say something to every nurse, every medic, every person who served in Vietnam. Thank you. For what you did. For what you saw. For what you carried home with you. Thank you." The audience stood. All of them. Thunderous applause. Margaret Sullivan was crying again, but this time from something that felt like release, like a burden finally shared. Doc Severinsen raised his trumpet and played a slow, reverent version of "America the Beautiful." The band joined softly, gently. It wasn't celebratory. It was a benediction. Johnny stood and saluted Margaret Sullivan from the stage. She saluted back, a crisp military salute that she hadn't given in 12 years. The applause continued for 2 full minutes. Johnny didn't try to stop it. He just stood there, tears running down his face, letting America see him break. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Johnny invited Margaret backstage. He introduced her to every crew member, every writer, every person who made The Tonight Show possible. "This woman saved lives while we made people laugh," he told them. "Remember that." He gave her his personal phone number on a card. "If you ever need to talk," he said, "about anything, call me." Margaret framed that card. She never called, but knowing she could was enough. Johnny kept a small American flag pin on his desk for the rest of his career. When asked about it, he'd say simply, "To remember the people who served while I told jokes." Margaret Sullivan died in 2003. Her family scattered her ashes in Ohio. But on her mantle, until the day she passed, sat a photograph, her shaking Johnny Carson's hand backstage at The Tonight Show, both of them with tears on their faces. The moment when silence finally broke.